He was supposed to be back before twilight. His wife's soup simmered on the stove, the last of the season's firwood stacked by the door, and Tomas had joked that he'd been eaten by squirrels if he was late. Instead, his boot track ended at the thicket, the axe left embedded in a stump like a question, and the only sound after that was the snow settling, patient as a held breath. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. Elena Marin hardly ever answered calls that had no data attached. Her life was scaffolding of metrics, GPS pins, and scheduled fieldwork. But she had known Tomas for a single season of bird counts and borrowed coffee between transects. And she answered because the voice on the line carried something like a plea folded into grief. "He's gone," the woman on the other end said. "Tomas's sister, Mara. And the police say he probably slipped. But we think something took him. You study cryptic mammal behavior. You take cameras into the woods. Please, find proof." The sleet dark road to the hamlet was a spine of black glass. Elena's rental's tires hissed like distant rain. The satellite on her dash spat coordinates that felt less like guidance than accusation. Every mile was another chance to find certainty or to be swallowed by superstition. She told herself she was a scientist making pragmatic choices. Document, gather, verify. But she also felt the pull of curiosity sharpened by pity, a personal ledger she hadn't planned to keep. The village lay tucked beneath a ridge of firs, smoke rising from chimneys like small, stubborn flags. Luca Ionescu met her at the edge of town with a half-built snowbreaker and the look of someone who had spent his life translating living rhythms into law. He was taller than the posters of local officials she'd seen, with winter wind-burned cheeks and eyes that watched without betraying the whole of what they saw. He wore the forest in his posture, years leaning into the wind, and when he smiled, which he did once, it was an apology and a promise at once. "You drove through the worst stretch," he said. "The track narrows after the mill. He reached for a little handheld, and she saw a line of keys braided with something like hair, tied in a knot of memory. "My grandmother left it." His voice was a flat river. He did not smile often. "We don't have much, Elena Marin, but we have questions." She showed him the note Mara had sent with the coordinates where Tomas's boot prints stopped. He read it, and the color drained from his face as if the letters had weight. "Tomas," he said, as if the name were a stone he could lift and feel for a pulse. "He brought wood for the pre-Christmas soup. I remember him." He stopped, the sentence breaking like ice. He was careful. They agreed to walk the last stretch together. Elena carried a slim camera kit, a backpack of batteries, and an internal checklist that crackled with the force of habit. Luca had an old rifle, not a hunting weapon, but a tool for signaling danger, knives, and a satchel of items that smelt faintly of dried herbs and smoke. He kept his hand near the satchel as if it might steady him. The forest received them by narrowing. Trunks drew closer until the world outside the firs seemed like a distant dream. Snow muffled the thump of their boots. They found the axe at the stump exactly where Mara had said it would be. Silver walnut handle, notched where Tomas's palm had worn it smooth. There were boot prints, Tomas's clear, measured stride, and then one set that grew larger and less human when the track widened into prints like overturned shadows. Elena crouched beside the bracken and let her gloved hand hover over the prints, inventorying. The pattern wasn't human. The heel was broad, the toes long and gnarled like the roots of a tree. Scientific training told her to take rubbings, to mark angles, to catalog stride length. Her hands moved because habit is a kind of faith, but because the prints seemed to absorb light, she felt the urge to annotate this grief into data and be done. Luca watched her with a patience she had not earned. "They're old stories," he said finally, as they rose and continued. "Omul Paduri, Pushin, Sasquatch, Yeti. We call them many names because the language for memory changes. But the forest remembers differently." He touched the air as if greeting a neighbor. "My grandmother taught me their signs." She had expected local color, folklore like ribbons. Instead, Luca's confidence in the old names had gravity. He spoke of obligations, of the boundary stones his family had kept, of prayers and small gifts left at tree hollows after harsh winters, of a covenant no legal paper had ever recorded. "It's not always about fear," he said. "They take what is broken to heal it. They keep what the hunters break. But sometimes," he hesitated, "sometimes they don't return it." Elena's scientific mind rebelled at the anthropomorphism. Healing metaphors and covenant words were not variables. Yet she could not deny the set of behaviors around the stump. A circle of crushed fern where something had knelt. A delicate pattern of fur that might have been wrapped around a child's mitten. A smudge on a branch like someone had wiped tears on bark. The camera she carried, a small trail model with a cracked plastic hinge she'd loaned herself, found what her eyes did not. A strip of film trapped in bracken, a canister half pulled from a pocket that had not belonged to Tomas or to anyone in their town. They found the camera where the snow had tried to swallow it. It was not the type Elena used in lab studies. It was older, weathered, with a strap braided from something dark and fibrous. When she pried it open with numb fingers, a card fell into the palm of her mitten. The card hummed with possibility. She felt the old electric thrill of discovery. This is what she'd spent a life chasing, a sequence of pixels that might rewrite a margin of belief. "Leave it?" Luca asked, though his voice said more of weight than counsel. No, she pocketed the card as if it were a talisman and as if it were evidence. "We document everything." The scientist in her had named the ritual. The human in her wondered if the card might hide a confession. Back in the hamlet, the square had gathered in the way small communities gather around a wound, huddled, muttering, hands jammed into scarves. Mara waited like an answering ache. When Elena offered the camera, Mara's fingers shook so hard she could barely slide it into her glove. "Film?" she breathed, as if the word itself might bring her brother back. Word traveled. Within an hour, the constable, a man in a high-collared coat, had arrived and taken photographs with a professional thoroughness that felt like the removal of bone. "We'll get a search party," he promised, but his eyes scanned the hills for the kind of logic that made sense to papers and deputations. He did not say the things the villagers murmured, that things in the wood did not like being catalogued, that leaving a camera was asking for trouble, that the old rites had kept the balance for centuries and were thin as paper now. Mara's plea was the last decisive thing. "If it's proof," she said to Elena, to Luca, to the constable, to the ring of faces, "then it's not just about Tomas. It's about them. My mother talked of the Ohm. Grandma would leave boiled milk on the porch. They helped us through cold winters. If you show this to the world, they'll come. They'll hunt. They'll be afraid. If you don't show," her voice broke, "if you don't show, he could have been taken because they needed someone to mend them, to fill a gap. I need to know which." Elena measured grief and curiosity like two weights. There was always a cost to disclosure. Science had a moral ledger: publish and protect. Her career told her that proof was truth. Proof changed policy and funding and belief. But she had also seen habitats destroyed by headlines. She had watched researchers publish and industry follow like wolves. The moral calculus slid under her skin like cold water. "You want me to find evidence that they're not monsters?" Mara finished. Elena thought of the footage she had not yet seen, of a card that might betray tenderness or terror. She thought of the joyless stringencies of her field notebooks and how they would translate an encounter into neat lines. She thought of her own sister, of soups gone cold while diagnosis awaited. "I will take the card," she said, "because answers are a kind of shelter. I'll review it. If there is something that can be measured, we will know. And if there isn't?" She could not finish, because certainty felt like a door that might let in more than light. Lucas's hand found hers as they stood outside Mara's kitchen, the village light leaking warm through a curtain. The touch was not dramatic. His fingers folded around hers with a familiarity that said he had been taught to care in the same way his family had learned to mend fence. It was the first small contact of the two worlds, Elena's measured touch and Lucas's inherited steadiness. He did not ask permission. She did not pull away. Inside her, Elena catalogued the contact for later. A pulse difference, the scent of juniper on his coat, a heat that wasn't explained by exertion. She had sworn to keep objectivity. In the dark corridor of the house, she had to remind herself that curiosity did not need romance to bloom, that certainty was sometimes best kept in the lab. Yet the moment sat in her like a seed. That night, in a room that smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and the clean wood of winter, Elena opened the camera's card under a single lamp. The files loaded, and a small screen swallowed the lamplight. The first frames were the kind of banal prelude that makes a reveal taste of betrayal. Branches, a rabbit, a fox nose. Then the footage changed. A hulking silhouette stepping around a fallen log, slow and careful, like someone measuring space against a beloved's outline. Hands, huge, calloused like old bark, cradling a fox as if it were a child. A second, smaller figure, guiding a mitten back to a child's hand with a tenderness that made Elena's breath hitch. She had read accounts of animal caregiving, of corvids and chimps showing surprising tenderness. This was different. The giants in the footage moved with ritual. One paused, turned to the camera as if sensing its gaze, and for a breath, Elena felt the weight of that look. It was not hostile. It was a recognition. There was more. The slow sweep of a bearded face, eyes like wells. The careful placement of sticks into a pattern she did not recognize. In the final frame, a human outline by the stump, Tomas, stood with a small packet at his feet. He looked up at the giant, and the giant reached down with the same deliberate care seen returning mittens and foxes. Tomas's mouth moved, and the camera caught a word no one could translate for her, the subtitle of the forest. Elena replayed the clip until the edges blurred. Her body cataloged the footage into thesis statements and ethics. The human in the frame, Tomas, was not being taken as prey. He was in conversation. He stayed. He was perhaps choosing to remain. The implication coiled in Elena's gut like a new, dangerous animal. This was not proof of monsters. It was proof of a civilization beyond her instruments, a kind of sociality older than parish records, and perhaps older than law. She felt the weight of Mara's question in the room like the press of winter against glass. Proof could save or condemn. It could be a melody of rescue or the first note of a hunting horn. She thought of Luca's grandmother's satchel and the key strand braided with hair. She thought of the blood words Luca had not divulged. If the footage showed tenderness and treaty, what did it mean for the covenants no one had written, for the laws that Luca's family kept like a secret religion? The hamlet slept in fits and starts outside. Elena saved the footage onto 3 separate drives, labeled them in her neat block script, and then sat, watching the screen, waiting for the world to decide. The forest breathed beyond the window as if listening. Her phone buzzed. A message from Mara, "Have you seen?" And another from head office reminding her to log the finding into the online portal. Every ping was a choice waiting to be made. At dawn, she and Luca would walk back into the firs, with evidence in their pockets and a fragile concord between them. Between the camera's intimate confession and the hamlet's demand for answers, The forest was a hinge. Elena felt, with a scientist's clarity and a human's fear, that stepping through it would unbalance more than footfall. She had come to gather data. Already, the data had found her. Elena slept in fits and starts, eyes half open to the same image. Thomas standing by the stump, the great hand lowered toward him, both of them caught in a frame that had no place in her taxonomy. When dawn came, it arrived as a thin blade of gray, and the village seemed smaller, compressed around the truth like smoke. She packed with meticulous, silent hands, drives warm in an inner pocket, the camera in a padded case, notebooks. Each item was a promise, to see, to record, to decide. Luca waited on the porch, coat buttoned, breath making two slow ghosts in front of his mouth. There was a bruise of worry under his eye she had not noticed the night before. Perhaps he'd lain awake with the same film spun inside him. He handed Elena a thermos of coffee that smelled of pine and sugar. "For the long walk," he said. "The weather will change. The wind holds grudges." They moved through the woods together but separately, two alternate ways of knowing. Elena listened for data in the crunch of ice and calibrated her rhythm to the spaces between branches. Luca read the land like a ledger of living things, fingers touching bark as if to greet a friend. The prints they followed widened and narrowed, as if the forest itself were breathing. Birds kept their distance, a hare darted with the startled geometry of small lives at risk. Elena wanted to ask about Luca's grandmother, about the hair and the knot on his keys, about the satchel, because her rational brain needed variables explained. He preempted her question the way someone might hand you the right glove without being asked. "She told stories," he said as they walked, voice low. "Not for children, really. For people who would listen like they were expected to act. The blood words are a promise, Elena. They say, 'Keepers of boundary, you will not speak of us to the world that does not know how to hear.'" Blood words. She repeated it the way a scientist repeats an observation that will later need a citation. Are they literal? Metaphoric? Both. He smiled without humor. She used to say that a covenant could be woven from breath and bone if you treated it like a law. "She braided this knot from hair when I was small and tied it to my wrist on my first winter watch. She told me stories about our duty to coax and close, to protect and conceal. That duty sits like a stone in my chest." He looked at her then, and the stone in his voice made her chest uneven. They reached Thomas' stump. The pattern of disturbed fern was older than their footprints now. Frost had begun to silver the depressions. Elena crouched, hands nearly numb, and found new traces. A thread of red woven into the bark where someone, creature or person, had tied something small. A tiny cluster of berries pressed into the snow as if offered and left, perfectly arranged. Lucas's fingers paused above them like a benediction. "They take the broken to mend," he murmured again, as if rehearsing the line would make it truer. "You said they might take things to heal them," Elena said, because the scientist in her needed to parse motives. "How do you know it's not simply scavenging or territorial behavior misinterpreted as tenderness?" "Because scavengers take and leave," Luca replied. "They don't return mittens or place berries in patterns. They don't kneel with gentleness. The ones out here, call them what you like, have rules." His eyes searched hers. "And sometimes rules mean we must choose between what is right for our species and what is right for another." Her hands trembled. Is there precedent? A human staying with them before? Lucas' jaw tightened. Once, long ago, a child vanished into the wood. She came back changed. She would not speak of names, only of warmth and a language of scent. The elders said the forest asked a trade, and the child gave laughter and returned with a name stitched to her palm. That's not science. That's memory. But we have records, old prayer books where people signed and read, leaving offerings and promises. My grandmother kept one under a mattress. She used to show me spells and stitches and told me to respect both. Elena wanted to catalog the stories, date them, test them against climate patterns, look for coinciding disappearances and resettlements. Her mind built a spreadsheet in the space between Lucas' words: incident, date, offering, outcome. But each time she tried to lay a grid over this living tangle, the forest presented a new variable. The pressed berries, the thread, the mitten pattern. Data refused to sit cleanly when morality and myth braided together. They walked deeper until the tracks turned inward toward a slope of downed pines. Here, the air smelled of wet earth and something else, an oil-sweet scent, like moss warmed in a kiln. The undergrowth opened to a hollow where the snow had been beaten flat, as if many bodies had rested there in a circle. In the center was something small and human-sized, a hand-stitched bundle wrapped in bark, tied with a strip of cloth. Elena's glove brushed the knot, and she pulled gently. Inside lay a mitten, Thomas's initials sewn in his slightly crooked script. Mara's gasp behind them was a small, jagged thing. "He left it," she said, as if the mitten were a message. "He left it and came back." "Maybe he dropped it and then," Elena began, but the camera had already told a different story. The footage had shown Thomas staying, not taken. His exchange with the giant had been deliberate. The mitten here, placed in a bundle, suggested ritual. It suggested a leaving that was chosen or arranged. A rustle from deeper in the hollow made them turn. Lucas' hand found a knuckle of wood, and he moved with the ease of someone who had bounded through this terrain as a child. He peered around a trunk, and his face changed, softening and then closing. "They're near," he said, scarcely above a whisper. Elena felt her pulse spike. "They're watching?" "Always," Lucas said. "They watch in ways we don't see. Scent, shadow, the tilt of a branch. If they are near, it's because they want to be." His eyes flicked to the drives at her belt. "If you show this footage to the world, Elena, you will not be showing it to those who can understand. You will be showing it to a world that shoots first and asks questions later." "It's evidence," she replied, for the argument she had rehearsed. "It's proof that could change policy, create protections." "Or strip them of sanctuary," he countered. "How many times have you seen a species protected into extinction by headlines? People who do not know the forest will come in droves." "Cameras mean tourists. Tourists mean trampled rituals. Trampled rituals mean a broken covenant." A wind cut through them, cold as appraisal. Elena understood the trade-off intellectually. Secretly, something in her recoiled at the thought of secrecy. She had built a career on transparency, but she loved living things too. Brittle, resilient species that had survived because of small, careful choices. The image of Tomas in the film, staying by the stump as a giant lowered its hand, reconfigured her sense of rescue. Perhaps the most ethical action was not broadcast, she thought, but stewardship disguised as science. Mara knelt by the bundle, fingers brushing Tomas' initials. Her face was a map of hope and grief. If he wanted to stay, why not leave a note? Why not tell us? Her voice was a raw wire. If he chose, why choose without telling us? "They have their own language," Lucas said softly. "Sometimes humans don't know how to ask to be kept. Sometimes humans offer themselves because they feel needed. Tomas might have felt it necessary, an act of repair. Or he might have been given a role. We cannot know until we understand the terms." "Maybe he was happy," Mara whispered, the words both a consolation and a torment. Elena realized how thin the line was between generosity and abandonment. A choice framed as service could look like desertion to those left behind. They walked farther, the hollow trailing off into an area where trees arched like cathedral ribs. Elena kept thinking of the footage, of the giant's tenderness, the mitten returned, the fox cradled. There was intelligence there, an ethics alien to human law, but not tied to survival. She thought of Luca's family, the boundary lines they'd capped, and the notion of a covenant that had survived because people honored it. It struck her that the collision now was not between myth and science, but between two kinds of fidelity, to the village and to the living forest. A new sound hummed through the trees, low and resonant, almost syllabic, as if the woods themselves were speaking. Luca halted, face attentive. He murmured something in a language Elena did not know, and the sound seemed to settle the air. It was not prayer exactly, or perhaps it was, a communing to soothe a power that was ancient and not wholly human. "You're pleading," Elena said, "with them?" "Sometimes they listen to the living," Luca answered. "Sometimes the living listen back." He stepped forward and left a bundle of his own at the base of a fir, a scrap of cured meat wrapped in cloth, the sort of small, respectful gift his grandmother would have taught him. Elena watched the way his hands moved, careful, ritualized, not theatrical. Mara stared, transfixed. Even in her grief, she understood the geometry of an offering. As they turned to leave, a shape slid between two trunks, fast, confident, and not an animal Elena recognized. It paused on a ridge and looked at them directly. For a heartbeat, human and something other coded the same space. The creature's eyes were dark and deep and held neither malice nor fear. Then it moved away, disappearing into the green hush with the elegant economy of someone who had chosen to be seen. Elena felt like someone who had been handed a secret she was not allowed to speak aloud. She felt the sweet pull of discovery and the bitter aftertaste of responsibility. The drives in her pocket felt heavy, like stones that could be used to build a bridge or to sink something beautiful. Back at the hamlet, the constable's face had folded into impatience. "We can't wait forever," he said. "Word gets out, people come." He looked pointedly at Elena. "If you have something, you should publish it. Let the department—" "Publishing will put a target on them," Luca interrupted, more quietly than she expected. "It will not be protection, it will be exposure. People who have never seen them will think monster and trophy. You know who that makes rich, Elena." The constable bristled. "We have laws, we have responsibilities. And we have a forest that will remember how we behaved," Luca fired back. "And if it remembers pain, it will answer in a way we cannot predict." Elena stood between them like a bridge fraying at both ends. Her hands clenched around the drives until the knuckles blanched. She thought of Thomas, happy, chosen, alone, and of the creatures in the footage. Science could be a shield. It could also be a sledgehammer. She could publish and force protection under an umbrella of law, but she could not be blind to how quickly law turned into industry. She could conceal and become an accomplice to silence. She could try to broker a third path. "Then we need to do what we're best at," she said, voice steadying. "We gather more data. We document patterns of behavior, not just a single event. We map their movement, their rituals, their interactions with humans. If we can show a pattern of caregiving, of rule, perhaps we can argue for protection in a way that isn't sensational. If we can involve people who respect the forest's boundaries, we can make a case that doesn't attract hunters." Luca regarded her for a long moment, and something in his set jaw softened. "You would argue for them?" "For now," she said, "and for Thomas. I owe Mara that much." He nodded once, the concession small but real. They had their first mutual plan, a fragile protocol. Only trusted cameras, no broadcasts, controlled access, a narrative framed as conservation, not spectacle. It was a compromise stitched from professional caution and ancestral obligation, neither wholly satisfying. When Mara reached for Elena's hand in thanks, Elena felt the press of expectation. The village watched them as if waiting for a verdict that would shape winter. Outside, the firs rustled, neighbors observing the pact with the patience of root and needle. Elena looked to Luca, to the hairknot at his belt, the thermos now empty, the mitten bundle at Mara's feet. Between them, the drives pulsed like small, dangerous hearts. They had wanted answers. The forest had answered in ways neither law nor lab could fully interpret. The first step, Elena understood, would be learning a new language, of gifts, of omissions, of the delicate ways of stewardship. She had always thought proof would free her. Now she suspected proof might bind her, and bind her to a man whose life was knotted to the things he swore to protect. The village meeting dissolved into a slow, bruised argument that left every seat warm with something like accusation. Flames licked low in the pub stove. Beer glasses sweated on the table. Mara's cheeks were streaked with dried tears. The constable paced with the kind of civility that warns, we can be reasonable or we can be compelled. Word had moved from porch to porridge to phone. A regional reporter's clipped voicemail sat in Elena's inbox like an ultimatum. Someone had already posted a shaky picture of the stump online, an anonymous hand, a rumor dressed as fact, and the edges of the hamlet's calm began to fray. "You can't keep it secret," the constable said finally, folding his wind-blown coat tighter. "If there's something out there, it's a public safety issue. We have to be transparent." Luca's reply came so quietly it might have been a continuation of the stove's crackle. Transparency is a word for windows. Windows break. Elena watched them both with the exhaustion of someone pulled in two directions. She had set rules in her head when she arrived: gather, verify, protect. But rules shift when the people you are trying to protect are not the ones who will read your papers. "We proposed a study," she said. "Controlled access, no broadcast. We'll ask the department for a classified review. They can approve measures, sanctuary zoning, restricted entry, without a public release. We can protect them." Murmurs. The constable snorted. "Classified review? You think the department will lock this away? They'll send cameras, scientists, men with permits who shoot more than footage. They'll take your data and sit on it, or sell it. Or they'll protect them," Mara countered, desperate for any stable shore. "We can't just let people walk in with torches." Luca didn't speak. He folded his hands on the table and watched the pub door as if expecting someone to step through it with a question he could not answer. Elena felt suddenly very aware of the drives tucked beneath her coat, of the way electronic proof could become an accelerant. She thought of all the environmental papers that had led to protections, nest boxes, fines. She also thought of the darker list, species that had been tracked into corners, commodified, sold to collectors. There was no neutral action here. "There's another problem," Lucas said at last. His voice had the brittle quality of glass under strain. "The covenant isn't just moral, it's legal in the old way." He glanced at Elena. "And in my family, it's literal." She had suspected his oath was metaphor, a cultural weight. She had not suspected the ledger of blood. "My grandmother," she swore to them, Luca continued, jaw set. "She cut her palm on a stone and smeared it into the roots of the eldest fir. She marked my father's skin. The words they gave her, blood words, were not just promises. They were a binding. If I reveal them, I betray generations. If I hide them, I may be part of a crime." Mara burst into sudden raw anger. "You knew Tomas," she said. "He was your friend. Did you tell him what the blood words meant?" Lucas' face went pale. "Tomas and I," he began, and then the pub seemed to inhale with the weight of whatever he would confess. "We were boys together sometimes. He helped on boundary nights. He was curious. When he wanted to learn our ways, my grandmother took him in small things. She warned him, "Don't speak what you do not understand." Tomas laughed at the secrecy at first. He wanted to know the stories. He talked of bringing science to the forest, as if tools could be taught to listen. And what happened? Mara's voice had the papered flatness of someone trying to hold grief steady. "I told him some," Luca said. "Not the blood words, but he felt the current of it. He wanted more. He asked to be present when offerings were made. My grandmother let him stand at the edge one night. She caught him looking at the giants with the kind of hunger that doesn't respect boundaries. She told him then to be careful." "And he wasn't?" Mara spat. "Did you stop him?" Luca's hands were suddenly small in his sleeves. "I tried," he admitted. "We argued. He said science would make them understood. He said understanding would make them safe. I told him that some things don't want to be understood that way. He said that was cowardice from those who don't want to change their ways." Elena felt the room tilt. There was heat and old smoke in the air, and in that tilt she saw the contours of betrayal. 2 men, 1 oath, 1 curiosity, a boundary overstepped. "So Tomas went into the woods with knowledge," she said. "He knew enough to cross into their trust." "Yes," Luca's throat worked. "And then something happened. My grandmother told me later that night. She woke and smelled the fur and the smoke of a torch, and something in her chest said that a bargain had been struck. She said she found footprints that led to the east and then stopped. She said she whispered the blood words and felt them tug like a latch." Mara's face liquefied. "So he stayed?" "He may have," Luca said softly. "Or he may have been asked to stay. Or he may have decided. There is a difference, to us and to you, but perhaps not to him." Elena thought of the footage again, of Tomas's slow nods near the stump, of the giant lowering its hand as if in benediction. A sense of betrayal rose in her, not only toward Luca, but toward the idea of choice itself. How much autonomy does a person have when they are offered a home in a form your culture would not recognize? How free is the heart when it learns a new grammar of belonging? "Why wouldn't he leave a note?" Mara demanded. "Why not tell us if he was going to join them?" "Maybe the note would have been meaningless," Luca said. "Maybe he thought we would not understand. Maybe he thought silence would protect both sides." "You think silence is protection?" Mara's laugh was brittle. "Is that a comfort? A reason? My brother disappeared with a mitten and a soup on his stove, and you tell me he stayed because he thought silence would be kinder? Do you know how that sounds?" Elena watched Mara cross her arms, a human shield against the betrayal. It occurred to her that whatever Tomas found in the forest might not have been merely a shelter, but a transformation that made his return impossible. She also began to see how Luca's silence, rooted in lineage and fear, mattered in a way that blood and law could not entirely excuse. Secrets had already stretched the rope between trust and truth until it began to fray. The constable cleared his throat. "Whether he stayed or was taken, the media will come. Authorities will come. We need a plan that includes the district. You can't simply—" "You don't understand," Luca snapped. "They will bring nets and bright lights. They will not respect a covenant that no longer exists on paper. They will record them sleeping and sell it to the highest bidder. Elena can try to frame this as conservation, but that requires trust we do not have." "Then we should go public," the constable said. "Bring law into it. Federal oversight could impose protection." "Or it could impose study," Luca said. "The kind that cages. I know the people who fund that kind of study. I saw them at conferences once. They put lights and rigs and life into boxes." The argument circled, a weather system of moral certainties that did not line up. Elena felt the thrum of fatigue, of being the object onto whom both sides offloaded their fears. She thought again of the drives, the footage, the mitten bundle, and the strange, deliberate tenderness of the giants. She sat forward. "We can't take sides yet," she said. "We need to know what the forest wants in a way we can translate without losing its meaning." Luca looked at her as if she had offered a bridge built from impossibility. "How do you translate a covenant?" "By building one that both sides can sign," she said. "We can design a protocol. Limited cameras at specified distances. No external broadcast. A local oversight committee, village, ranger, scientist. A legal framework that grants sanctuary with penalties for trespass. We will approach the department, but we will present a model, controlled, restorative, and enforceable." Mara's expression softened minutely. "You would do that for him? For my brother?" "For all of them," Elena said. "If they're caretakers, if they're enacting rules of repair, they deserve protection. If they're just beings trying to be left alone, they deserve sanctuary. We can be advocates without being headlines." Luca's shoulders lowered as if a weight had shifted by millimeters. "My grandmother used to say you can teach a fence to hold water, or you can teach a river to run. Perhaps there is a way to do both." But the room was not soothed. Someone muttered that outsiders would not stay away. A man at the back swore his cousin would come with cameras. Angry hands pushed against the table. The constable's jaw clenched. Secrets had already spawned fractures. Between the committed and the fearful, between lineage and law, between a town that could love and a world that could exploit. Elena felt the fragile protocol she proposed as a paper raft on a rising sea. When the meeting broke, they did not leave as a community, but as clusters of suspicion. Mara hugged Elena as if sealing a contract. Luca and Elena stepped out into the night and stood for a long time under the stars. Snow began to fall, a slow verdict that smudged footprints and softened edges. "Don't go public yet," Luca said. "Wait, let me speak with the elders. Let me see if my grandmother wrote anything in her ledger that might help." "And in the meantime?" Elena asked. "In the meantime," he said, looking at the drives at her half-covered chest, "we strengthen the boundary. We take down the online posts. We keep this contained." She nodded, but the containment felt provisional, like a bandage on an open artery. Secrets had been revealed, fractures had widened and would not stitch themselves simply by promise. She wanted to believe the protocol would hold, that law and lineage could co-make a shelter. But part of her, the scientist who had always believed demonstration could convert hearts, ached with the knowledge that data released could free them or destroy them. As they walked back toward the cottages, a silhouette moved between firs, tall, quiet, then gone. Elena felt watched, not with the urgency of an ambush, but with the deliberateness of an audience choosing when to applaud. She glanced at Luca. In his profile, the memory of his grandmother's braided knot looked suddenly like a map with no compass. Between him and the forest lay a canyon of obligations. Between her and the footage lay an ethical weight she had not been trained to bear. Secrets had been spoken and already begun to harden into sides. Trust, once fractured, needed a surgeon. The forest, patient as ever, waited. The trees held their breath like a congregation waiting for some small mercy. Snow muffled the hamlet's worried voices, made every footstep an amplified choice. Elena felt the weight of people's expectations press behind her ribs as if the whole village rode each of her decisions. Luca stood beside her, shoulders squared into the wind, the hairknot at his belt bright as an old promise. Between them, the drives lay like hot coals, proof that could warm or burn. "We need a plan that proves we can protect them and honor the covenant," Elena said, voice low so only Luca could hear. She had rehearsed this sentence all night, shaping it between ethical teeth until it fit. We start with the cameras we have. We expand the protocol to include non-invasive sensors, scent markers, and a local enforcement team. We create a legal framework for sanctuary tied to penalties for trespass, enforceable, not just polite. He studied her as if she were a hypothesis and he the last field test. "You'll need people you can trust," he said finally, "people who will not leak. My grandmother's ledger lists 3 names, family who have kept watch. They'll help, but there's an urgency. Do you understand that? The more eyes, the more danger." "I do," Elena said. She could taste the calculus of risk. "We'll restrict access. We won't publish. We'll present our findings in a classified review to the department and insist on sanctuary designation before any public release." Mara appeared at the edge of the square, breathless, cheeks reddened by cold and indignation. She held something wrapped in oilcloth, and when she untied it, Elena saw the small carved token Tomas had been known to tuck into his bread pocket, a sliver of wood with a crude star etched into it. "He always carried this," Mara said, voice small. "Maybe it's a sign. Maybe it's an apology. Maybe it's a map." Luca took the token gently, and the gesture looked like a vow. "We'll add it to the ledger," he said, "a marker of intention. I'll place it at the eldest fur tonight. It's a pledge. We will watch and we will keep." The first action was simple and sacramental. Luke, Elena, and the 3 elder keepers from Luca's grandmother's list walked into the trees as the sky bruised toward night. They moved with the hush of people performing a rite. The elders carried bundles of things, smoked fish wrapped in linen, clean river stones, a small bowl of milk, and each item carried the ritual weight of decades. Elena, clutching a drive to her chest like scripture, felt exposed in a way that data never accounted for: human culpability. They reached the eldest fir, a trunk like a bastion. Lucas's hand trembled when he moved to a knot of roots and eased Thomas's wooden token into a notch. He murmured the words his grandmother had taught him, old syllables like weather, like apology, like plea. Elena watched the way his lips shaped the language and felt an ache shed not expected. It was not just ritual. It was the sound of a man trying to repair something he had helped damage. The forest answered with the smallest thing, a breeze that smelled of damp fir and wild mint, like a hand pressed to the temple. From the shadowed understory came a rustling, and then the gentle footfall of something large and slow. The elders stood still, hand over heart, faces smoothing into features that called to memory instead of fear. A shape stepped into the fringe of lamplight, tall, broad, its fur like riverbed hair. Elena's breath hitched. The creature's head turned, and for one luminous second, its eyes met her own. Not an interrogative stare, but a recognition that was less about species and more about a ledger reconciled. Luca stepped forward first, leaving the elders behind with their offerings. He held no weapon. He offered instead his hands, open and bare. "We have come to ask for mercy," he said in the old words he had half learned and half feared. His voice cracked in places the oath had hollowed out. "We will protect. We will not let them be hunted. We swear the covenant will be renewed." The creature watched him, nostrils flaring as if taking in the very grammar of the promise. It reached a hand the size of a barrel and placed it, palm down, on a stone. The elders whispered and laid their palms on top, human and other, pressing warmth into cold rock. A sound rose then from the depths of the wood, low and harmonic, a chord that slid along Elena's spine and unlatched something she had kept carefully bolted: sorrow, a fierce tenderness, and the recognition of obligation shared. Behind them, a sudden commotion, shouts and the crunching of many boots broke the delicate scaffold the night had provided. Headlights peeled toward the hamlet like a threat. Someone had chosen to ignore the embargo. A group of men, faces red with anger and alcohol, pushed into the clearing, brandishing torches and the crude charm of certainty. "Monsters!" one of them shouted. "We finish what took Tomas." The moment did not slow. It was a blade drawn through winter. Elena felt the air split from it, the ethical axes of her life and Lucas snapping taut. The creature reared, nostrils flaring, then lowered. Its hands hung like decisions. The elder stepped between the creature and the mob, a fragile human fence. Elena's brain catalogued responses: call the constable, deploy the reserve camera, warn, then caught itself. There would be no neutral technocratic fix to a live, breathing moral catastrophe. Luca moved like a man who had learned to negotiate with more than judges. He put himself between the creature and the mob, as if his body could be a treaty. "Stop!" he called. His voice was not command, but plea. "They're not monsters. They are bound by a covenant. They are our guardians. If you throw fire, you break an ancient promise." The mob jeered. "Promises don't feed us," a voice spat. "We want our man back." Mara pushed through the crowd like a small storm. She held Tomas' carved star high and screamed, "Do you want him to die for your fear?" Her voice cracked in a way that made some of the men pause, as if surprised by the kindly ferocity of grief. Elena stepped forward then, feeling her scientist's steadiness give way to a human hazard she had not predicted: fury for preservation. She pulled a dry from her inner pocket and raised it like a flag. "Take it," she shouted to the mob and to the men with torches. "See what they are. See what this is, their gentleness. Or don't. But if you come into those woods with torches and guns, you will make them defend themselves. You will make them angry in ways we cannot control." The challenge settled like a gauntlet. One of the men lunged forward, and in the push, Elena felt the heat of the moment topple into violence. The creature reacted then, not an instinctual lunge, but a decisive motion that startled Elena with its restraint. It moved to pull a torch away, maddened by flame. And in the scuffle, a hand, human, enraged, swung a club. The club connected not with the creature, but with Luca. He hit the ground like a slammed door. Elena's world reduced to the sound of Luca's breath leaving him. The mob surged back at the sight. Perhaps the sight of their anger hitting bone was its own shock. The creature froze then, with a sorrow so ancient it felt like an apology, gathered Luca into long arms, and carried him away from the flames as if moving a child from a street. "No!" Mara screamed, and the sound cut the mob into smaller pieces. Some fled, some stayed, pinned by conscience and by the haunting image of a man, our man, cradled by a being they'd come to denounce. The elder stood and sang low, a chant that sounded like weather and blessing. The creature, Luca in its clasp, turned once and looked at Elena. In the creature's eyes, something like a question and a benediction met. Protect or publish? Elena realized with a clarity spurred by terror that choice would define the rest of her life. Luca's face, pale and hollow with fear, met hers. "Keep them," he mouthed. "If you publish, they'll come. If you hide them, we can save him." Her response was the fastest, least scientific thing she had ever done. She dropped to her knees and pressed her forehead to Luca's hand where it rested against fur, a human seal over an impossible bargain. "Then we keep them," she said, voice of promise. "We will build the sanctuary and the legal shield. We will be the ones who say no to cameras. We will be the ones who stand between fire and fur." The elders nodded, tears on their cheeks like dew. The creature set Luca gently on the snow and touched his brow with the side of its hand, the same way a parent might balm a fever. Luca's breath shuddered and then steadied. He opened his eyes and looked at Elena as if she had rewired his future. "You give them sanctuary," he whispered, "and I will renounce the secrecy. I'll bring the ledger to the department, but on our terms. I will sign my name to the promise." Mara slid down and took his other hand. Her fingers trembled. "Promise for promise," she said. "You give us back our brother in whatever way he is, and we give you our silence and our watch." The pact was not legal paper, but the older thing, word held against the world by people who had something to lose and something irredeemable to protect. Elena thought of drives and publications and the kind of fame that burns like dry straw. She also thought of Luca, cradled by a creature with the tenderness of human hands. She weighed them like seeds and chose the one that fed living things rather than headlines. That night, the hamlet kept a watch. The mob dispersed, shamed or sated, and those who remained formed a human ring around the village. Shutters closed, lights low. Elena and the elders walked the perimeter, placing markers and notes, recording patrols and penning legal language in the margins of a binder that smelled like coffee and pine. Luca lay wrapped in blankets in the farmhouse by the stove, drifting between fever and the slow healing that comes when violence is met with care. Before dawn, when snow washed the world clean, Elena sat by Luca's side and took his hand. His palm was warm and calloused. He smiled, small and crooked, like someone who had been given a terrible gift and chosen to accept it because it meant more than being right. "You could have published," he said, voice hoarse. "I could have," she answered, "but I couldn't watch them be caged, and I couldn't watch you become a martyr to a secret." He squeezed her hand, then pulled her to him with a tenderness that matched the giant's. They were quiet for a long time, two people bound by a vow that had the shape of something older than law. Outside, the forest moved like a sleeping thing, protective and watchful. Elena felt, with a scientist's awe and a human heart's conviction, that she had traded a career's explosion for something more dangerous and more true. The stewardship of a covenant between species, and the fragile clasp of love that could hold across vows and mysteries. In the weeks that followed, they created their protocol: sanctuary designation written into local law, limited cameras managed by the village and Lucas elders, strict penalties for trespass. Elena wrote reports that were mailed to select eyes under seal. The drives stayed locked. Tomas's wooden star rested under the eldest fir, a sign that a life had been altered and honored. And sometimes, when the snow melted and the sap rose in the trees, Elena would stand at the edge of the wood and hear the low harmonic chord Luca had mentioned. She would think of the giants moving like guardians and of the way Luca had been carried, and she would understand that some anthers are not a conclusion but a crossing, a reckless, redemptive passage in which you give up certainty to keep something alive. The hamlet learned to breathe differently. Where once gossip hung in windows like dryer lint, restraint became a practiced muscle. Shutters closed at dusk, phones handed over at doorways, a rota of watchers whose eyes were kinder than curiosity. Elena and Luca took turns at the eldest fir, sanding Tomas's wooden star until its edges were worn smooth by human attention and meaning, as if careful handling could translate absence into stewardship. They rewove the ledger Luca's grandmother kept, inked promises, signatures from villagers, a mapped perimeter, and delivered that pact to a sympathetic regional attorney who understood that law could be a shield if written with humility. The classified review Elena had promised arrived not as sensation, but as quiet bureaucracy: sanctuary designation, restricted access, fines for trespass. Protections that felt thin against centuries, but thicker than nothing. Mara visited the edge of the wood with soup and small gifts for the elders. Sometimes she left a crust of bread at the notch where Tomas's token rested, and sometimes she spoke aloud to the trunks as if confession could cross species. She learned in slow fits to accept that the brother she loved had chosen a grammar she would never fully translate. She also learned the small gratitude of knowing he was not gone into violence, but into a purpose that baffled and soothed at once. The village's anger cooled into a wary watchfulness. A few still muttered about trophies and capitulation, but more found comfort in the ordinance, in fines, and in the quiet authority of a covenant translated into paper. Elena kept 3 drives locked in a box whose combination she alone and Luca knew. Copies were encoded and stored in a sealed trust for future generations and for legal defense, not for headlines. Her scientific articles shifted tone. Carefully written, peer-reviewed pieces about behavioral patterns observed under strict, non-invasive protocols. Papers that nudged a skeptical world toward protection without spectacle. She taught local children how to read tracks and how to whisper to trees, blending field method with reverence until the next generation might steward what they had inherited. Luca renounced secrecy in a way that felt like unbinding a cord. He presented the ledger to authorities on the condition they honor the covenant's terms, and he began to teach the elders how to negotiate with law as well with root and fur. He healed slowly, physically, under blankets and salves, and spiritually, by holding Mara's hand when she needed an ally, and Elena's when she needed a mind that could both measure and forgive. On the first thaw, Elena walked the boundary alone at dawn. Sun slanted through needles, and the firs breathed sap and patience. She paused where the ground was still soft from winter's thaw and left a small sealed drive beneath the same notch where Tomas's star slept. It was not proof for the world. It was a promise for anyone who would guard with respect. Evidence held in trust, a covenant in code. As she rose, a shadow detached itself from the trees and lingered at the edge, tall, deliberate, and not frightening. And for a brief, inexplicable second, Elena felt recognized, not as a scientist announcing discovery, but as a guardian who had learned to keep a secret that keeps a life.